So, good morning, everyone. I think we can start now. We are already a little bit late. So thank you for being here in presence, and also thank you to those who came from online. I will leave the room now to Daniela Minetti, because this conference is hosted within the Transumare Festival, which is really an entire week of events. So please, Daniela.
Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to Transumare Festival. Sustainability, ecosystem services, enterprise, biodiversity is the words of this meeting. I'm happy to greet you from Regione Liguria and that organize this trip, this journey with the University of Geneva and many actors of the territory, local public administration, but also researchers and enterprise and the simple people of the rural community that are involved with us in this job. It's important for us understand and communicate the value of the biodiversity and ecosystem services, not yet for ethical on scientific reason, but for the life of every one of us, and for our economy and our opportunity to live in the country. And so it's really important to study and analyze every step of this journey. Now we know very well that we have a high quality of environment, high quality of product, and we know that the consumer is is responsible and want to buy something more than just a cheese or just a product. So we have the point to start, and we have the final point. We have to build all that are in the middle of this journey. And so it's really important, your job and this conference, and Eva in this journey with us for 3 years, because we need your results and your job. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniela. I'm sorry, I forgot to say that it's Regione Liguria, Daniela Minetti is here as Regione Liguria, because it's Regione Liguria that hosts our conference. And I think this testifies the strong relation between the administrative local level and the university. And I think that this exchange is very, very, very important. So I'm particularly pleased to be here today because this conference concludes a 3-year postdoctoral teaching, a module called EVA, which stands for Environmental Valuation Accounting, and is a module, a Jean Monnet module, so under the auspices and also the financing of the Erasmus Plus project. And well, it has been an exciting experience for me, and I want to thank all the teachers that have contributed to the success of this EVA. We have part of them, we are here, Elena Gomarsino, Daniela Minetti, Paola Ramassa, and Costanza Di Fabio. And during the 3 years, a community has grown up around EVA, and a community of scholars and experts involved in the issue of environmental accounting and environment in general, environmental economics in general. And so I hope that this community will continue to grow up beyond the lifespan of the EVA module, and also to give rise to projects, to research, to common work in the future. So I don't want to leave, I don't want to take and waste your time. So I want to go straight to the introduction of our lecture for today. I hope it's already connected. I asked the technicians for that.
Good morning, everybody.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for being here. I was just about introducing your lecture. I must say this is a really a great pleasure to me and honor to introduce our lecturer. And he is Lars Hein. He's a professor of ecosystem services and environmental change at the Wageningen University. He's also deputy chair of the environmental system analysis group at the same university. So he has a role as an expert in ecological economics, resource management, and land use planning, and is well known in the academic community, in the international community. Also, for his being a member of various international organizations such as the World Bank, the FAO, and so on. It's particularly relevant, his presence here today, because he has been one of the main contributing authors to the United Nations system of environmental economic accounting, ecosystem accounting, but since the time where ecosystem accounting was still an experimental framework, which was in 2012. And so I leave the room to you. I thank you so much for being here, and please.
Thank you very much for these kind words, and thank you very much also for inviting me. I hope you can hear me well. Is it clear enough when I talk like this?
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you very well, but can you also hear me?
Yes, we can hear very well. From here, I ask in the room, but they say yes. I want
very
to...
Good. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so then let me just, because that was a long enough introduction about myself, as I think, so thanks again for inviting me. I would like to share my screen now.
I must say, if you want, you can have the translation in the room. Okay.
There we go. I think you can now see my presentation, right?
Yes.
Wonderful. So in this keynote presentation, I would like to take you through the ecosystem accounting approach. And as was introduced, I've been involved in developing the approach and also testing it and further developing it from the start, which was about 2010, so 12 years ago. And in these 12 years, a lot has happened. And I would like to give you a quick overview of all these different advances that have been made. And so the main topic of today is ecosystem accounting, or more specifically, the system of environmental economic accounting / ecosystem accounting. And of course, I'll explain that context. I would also like to zoom in a bit on the valuation part of ecosystem accounting, also given the topic of the conference today. And then also I would like to share some thoughts and some applications on how ecosystem accounting can support public policy making. And my presentation is about 45 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. Let's see, so there's room for questions after the presentation. And I would like to start with this major highlight. About 1 year ago, something quite exceptional happened, I think, in some ways, because the ecosystem accounting framework was adopted as a global environmental standard. And to people working in the statistical offices, and in the last 12 years, I've been working very closely with many statistical offices and also the UN Statistics Division. This is a big thing to have something elevated to the level of a statistical standard. Because there's a methodology, there's a framework, but for something to become a standard, means there's a certain amount of trust in the approach. And well, you can see a very nice endorsement even by Secretary General of the United Nations. What happened was that ecosystem accounting was evaluated by the UN Statistical Commission, and it was decided that the biophysical part of ecosystem accounting, so the first 7 chapters to be specific, that they were mature enough to count as a statistical standard. And that means that statistical offices all over the world have a great stimulus now to also start using this methodology. And in my mind, maybe a personal note here, one of the reasons why I have been so interested in this from the start is that coming from academics, my experience is that we work a lot, of course, on environmental economics, on environmental sciences, on environmental challenges. And a lot of wonderful work is going on in academics. But our problem is, and I can say our because, of course, I'm coming from a university myself, is that we usually almost always we get funding for specific projects. And of course, those projects end at some point, after 4 years, after 5 years, and we've got papers and we've got a lot of data. But I think to move to a better management of our ecosystems, our environmental resources, we need a database. We need an information system that really is kind of evolving over time and is being updated also every year with new information. So not a 4-year or 5-year time frame, but something that will continue for decades. And that is why it's, in my mind, it has been so important to work with statistical offices, because they always have that long time frame, right? Economic statistics are being produced have been produced since 60, 70 years. So in that sense, there's, in my mind, there was a great synergy in working together between academics, research organizations, and statistical offices. Now, let's go back, because this was just an introduction slide. Let's go back and have a look at where this is coming from. And this slide, of course, is not showing anything new to all of you. The main message here is that in order to understand how our economy functions, in order to understand how we create income and well-being for everybody, we need to understand our capital assets. We need to understand the human or social capital, or produced capital, also our natural capital. And natural capital, of course, is often divided into non-renewable natural capital, as for example, oil and gas reserves, or renewable natural capital. And that, of course, has to do with ecosystems, because they are being replenished and replenishing themselves. So we can harvest wood in an ecosystem. If we do that properly, sustainably, we can do that every year. So, of course, very different from oil and gas. And of course, that also makes it a bit more complicated to account for those renewable resources. So produced capital, that has been measured by statistical offices since, as I mentioned already, 70 years at least. So, and how did this come about? Well, looking at our history books, we know that in the 1930s, there was a big economic and financial crisis. And as you can see on this picture, massive unemployment, underinvestment in the economy, and there was a broad realization that society needed to measure what's happening with produced capital. What were the investments? What was the labor demand from industries? So, and at the time that was lacking. So this was the basis for developing the national accounts, and the system of national accounts, which you see the last version in the right-hand corner. Is a system to measure economic activity. So economic production, the use of labor and capital, and one of the indicators, among several others, of course, that you measure with your national accounts is GDP, the gross domestic product. And we all know that. So gross domestic product is measured with the system of national accounts. And of course, it is important that all the countries in the planet are using the same methodology, because we need to compare GDP numbers between countries. And of course, there's some differences, but at a broader level, there's consistency between that, how that is measured. And there's at least consistency in the basic concepts and the approach to valuation that is used. And this system of national accounts, this is kind of managed, overseen by the UN Statistical Commission that contains the representatives of statistical offices worldwide at the most senior level. Now, one of the problems, if you want, with national accounts is that it does not do justice to environmental matters. There's no environmental degradation, or very little, reflected in the national accounts, and depletion of natural resources is also not measured. And so the national accounts are deficient in terms of the way ecosystems and the environment are dealt with. And that's not strange, because when this system was developed, starting in the 1930s, there was still plenty of natural capital, so people were not generally concerned about natural capital. So this has been long recognized since 1970s already. There have been attempts to think about, okay, how then do we kind of come up with a way to account for natural capital, for ecosystems, but initially mainly focusing on those non-renewable resources such as oil and gas. And that is why underneath the system of national accounts, two satellites have been developed, the system of environmental economic accounting / the central framework, which you see on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side you see the ecosystem accounting. This was the first version, still called experimental ecosystem accounting. Now the experimental, of course, has been dropped. So those two systems are satellites of the system of national accounts, which means they're complementary. They comprise information which is not in the national accounts, dealing with natural capital, of course. That is important to manage our economy. But they are linked and connected. So it is possible to exchange data, for example, between the two. And that is very handy because sometimes for ecosystem accounting, for example, we want to have information on the outputs of agriculture or sectors that depend upon ecosystems. So those can be easily used in the ecosystem accounts from the national accounts. Let us have a bit more of a detailed look at those two approaches. So the central framework contains three basic elements. So flow accounts, there's measurement of energy, materials, water, and also emissions to the environment. There's also some asset accounts, measurement again of energy, materials, water, and also carbon, land and soil, and some biological resources such as timber. But in general, you can say that renewable natural resources are not well covered by that central framework. And the idea of replenishment is not in there. The third element, I should say, is the measurement of environmental expenditure, meaning the amount of money that society uses on an annual basis for environmental remediation. For example, the costs related to wastewater treatment. So these three things are measured in the central framework, and it's not really well attuned to ecosystems. It has also been a statistical standard already since 2012. And I should say there's two subsystems, so satellites of the satellites, if you want, one dealing with water and one dealing with agriculture and forestry and fisheries, which was managed by FAO, of course, in Rome. Now, given that the central framework was not well able to capture ecosystems, the dynamics of ecosystems, the use of ecosystems, the replenishment of ecosystems, about 2010, we started initially with a small group, but very quickly that became a much larger group managed by the UN Statistical Division to develop first a framework, then guidelines, and now a statistical standard in part for ecosystem accounting. And again, the principle is that it's aligned with national accounts. So in terms of value concepts, for example, what we measure is flows of ecosystem services. And so here you see how the statistical community connected to the academic community will, of course, work on ecosystem services has been going on also since decades. But here the two things came together. And ecosystem assets as well. So just as all accounts, we want to know what is, say, in your bank account, what is coming in every month, and what is going out every month. And there's something specific also about ecosystem accounts compared to the other accounts, and that is that it is a spatial approach. And that's important because, of course, for the national accounts, you would like to know perhaps by municipality or by province or by state in some countries what the economic activities are. But the specific distribution over the landscape doesn't matter that much. for ecosystems, of course, it is crucial that you understand, also that spatial component, because ecosystems are very heterogeneous in space, right? A forest may deliver quite different services in one area compared to only 1 kilometer away. And so that's why we kind of build that spatial approach very centrally into the ecosystem accounting approach. And of course, that poses some challenges also sometimes, right? To connect spatial information to accounts. Now, once these ecosystem accounts are developed, so what can you do with it? So in blue, you see the original information that's in the national accounts. And the picture kind of illustrates that the situation has changed a lot on the planet since 1930. And now, at that time, we had economic financial crisis. I think it's not too far-fetched to say that we have an ecological crisis on the planet now. And we have to do something with that. And of course, only monitoring is not enough. The monitoring will have to lead to actions. But if we don't monitor, if we don't understand how ecosystems are changing, it is of course quite difficult to also design mitigation measures and rehabilitation measures. And of course, the nice thing about ecosystem accounting is that you can link ecosystems to economic activity. And that's shown in this slide here. Now you see how different ecosystem services, such as timber, fish, and water, how they are connected to economic activities, such as in the agricultural sector or the fishery sector. But it's not only about provisioning services, but also cultural and regulating services are also part of the ecosystem accounting approach. So things like pollination, air filtration, tourism, recreation. So we're now able to understand, once fully implemented, of course, how economic activities depend upon ecosystems. And also because ecosystem accounts are in themselves quite detailed and spatially explicit, there's a whole lot of other things that you can also do with ecosystem accounting. You understand your changes in natural capital, dependency of economy and employment also on natural capital. And also it's a very detailed spatial database that you can use to manage your resources. And I'll show some examples of that later on. Well, since the first time it was published, I think that was 2012, the ecosystem accounts, the framework, that received quite a lot of attention, I would say, from many countries on the planet. And here you see some countries that published ecosystem accounts in January 2020. And of course, the number has increased since then. Also, there's a number of initiatives going on in Europe, in the European Commission, to further see how, if and how, perhaps member states of the EU should, in a compulsory manner, develop ecosystem accounts and report ecosystem accounts to Eurostat as part of the general accounting efforts. So you can really see that things are taking up. United States is here light blue, and it was in 2020 still a research project in the United States, but now I think a month ago it was announced from the White House that also the United States will start producing ecosystem accounts, and they will start even earlier in 2023, I understand. So that means, there's been a big take-up of ecosystem accounting worldwide, and also China has been quite active, and they've produced a gross ecosystem or gross ecological products, so a GEP, as a kind of a complementary indicator to the GDP. And that indicator of GEP is also quite connected to the ecosystem accounting approach, and sometimes also using the same methodologies. Now, that was the kind of the context and the history of ecosystem accounts. Then let us look at the ecosystem accounts themselves. So what do we have inside the ecosystem accounting approach? And just as with national accounts, there's actually several individual accounts in ecosystem accounting. The first account is the ecosystem extent account, which is basically about types of ecosystems that you have in a country. The second account is the condition account, which is informing on the health of ecosystems or the state of ecosystems. The third account is the ecosystem services supply and use account, so which ecosystem services are supplied by ecosystems. And the fourth one, the fourth core account, is the monetary ecosystem asset account. And you'll see extent and condition are only physical accounts. The ecosystem service account is physical plus monetary, and the ecosystem asset account is only a monetary account. Then we have the thematic accounts. There's 4 thematic accounts that deal with oceans, urban ecosystems, greenhouse gas emissions, and biodiversity. greenhouse gas emissions and sequestration, I should say, and stocks. So I'd like to give some examples now of these accounts. Just one more picture here, so how they connect. So you can see that the ecosystem extent account, that's the basis. Where are the ecosystems? Which ecosystem types do you have? That feeds into the ecosystem condition account. It feeds also into the physical ecosystem service account. Then there's an element of monetary valuation. So you can move the monetary ecosystem services account, and based on your ecosystem service account in monetary terms, you can produce your monetary ecosystem asset account. And for each account, you would have maps. You see a map for a specific province here in the Netherlands, as well as accounting tables, and I'll come to that. So this is the extent account for the Netherlands. You see there's about 35 different units. This is the map for the whole country, where you see in the middle some forest. You see, of course, the coastal areas, the cities, it's concentrated in the west of the country. We zoom in on one province. You can see the map is quite detailed. The purple in the middle is the industrial area of Rotterdam. And so you can see the extent account is wall to wall. It's covering all the surface, the area of a country. And we can zoom in even more because the account is really very detailed. In this case, it has a resolution of just several meters. And you can see here, this is part of the province of South Holland, where they had a nature development project some years ago. So you can see this 5-year period, and you see the green area increasing in the south of this picture. So that's the extend account. Of course, our extend account in the Netherlands is relatively easy to produce because we have a lot of baseline data, topographical maps, land registration databases, the cadastre, etc. So we combine those. We also worked on extent accounting in Indonesia, and there we use satellite images. And here you see Sumatra. So it's a huge area, but again, the extent account was produced at a high resolution, in this case 30 meters. And the interesting thing here is that you see the different types of crops in the extent account. And that is something that was not previously available with this level of detail, even to the government of Indonesia. So that really provided some new insights. Then we move to the condition account, so the second account. And those are biophysical indicators reflecting the state and health of ecosystems as far as they are policy relevant, because we need to we need to produce accounts that are relevant, that are useful for people. And a second element that is covered in the condition account is the capacity of ecosystems to provide services. And so those two elements, those two reasons can be underlying a specific condition indicator. And so some examples: soil organic matter. This was developed because there's been some discussion in the Netherlands on that maybe a depletion of soil organic matter, and that should be a concern for agriculture. That didn't really show up in our accounts. It didn't seem to be such a big problem, but still it is in the accounts now. And also there's water quality, which you see on the right-hand side. And some of you will recognize that this is just reporting to the Water Framework Directive. So there we took existing reporting systems and we integrated that into the accounts. This is an example of a condition indicator which is new, so which was developed for the specific purpose of ecosystem accounting by the Dutch Statistical Office. So all the work, I should really say, is done. All these maps are done in collaboration between the Dutch Statistical Office and Wageningen University. And here you see, I'm sorry for the Dutch sentence there, you see the hedgerow density expressed as kilometers of hedgerow per hectare, per square kilometer across the country. And you see some areas, especially in the north, for example, where there's a high hedgerow density. And the farmers there were actually very happy with our map. We spoke to the farmers associations and they said, look, now we can finally prove that we are doing a big effort in our landscape to protect those hedgerows for biodiversity. And of course, they would also like at some point to receive some payment for that, but that's then the next phase. So our responsibility as ecosystem accountants, I think, stops by showing that these people are doing a really good job, and then it can inform the policy debate here. On the middle, you see that white spot, maybe you noticed, and that is the forest area. So of course, also in that forest area, the hedgerow density is quite low. I think one of the nice things about the condition account is also that it helps to interpret data that you see and also makes things more transparent. And just as an example here for Palawan in the Philippines, where I also did a bit of work. Now you see in the research reports, you would find the top the top graph where you see different coral reefs. You see the percentage of coral reefs. It's declining very rapidly. It's difficult to interpret, but I think then if we have aggregated indicators, and the idea of condition accounting is to produce such aggregated indicators, and then it becomes a bit easier to communicate also how ecosystems are changing to policymakers and to the public. Let's move now to the ecosystem services account. So that contains the supply of ecosystem service and use of ecosystem services. And in accounting, the ecosystem accounting, the central principle is that the supply by the ecosystem is equal to the use of ecosystem services in society, in the economy. And that is that we needed that to, well, you can say to balance the books, because supply needs to match the use. And of course, there's a physical supply and use account, tables and also maps. And from those maps and tables, we can then produce a monetary supply and use account. And what you see is that the ecosystem services are in the rows, and in the columns you have the specific ecosystem types that are providing those services in physical terms and monetary terms. It can also be expressed, of course, on a per hectare basis or on a total basis, on a national basis. Just some examples of the maps, right? We have, of course, the corresponding tables. We see here the potatoes or the cereals. Potatoes is the most profitable crop for the farmers in the Netherlands. So if they have a choice, and the farmers on clay soils, what you see here, have that choice, they will grow potatoes at least once in 3 years. This is the timber account. Before that, the Netherlands had actually relatively poor data on timber. It is not a major ecosystem output, ecosystem service in our country. But what's nice is that we now have information on the timber harvest, on the timber regrowth, and also on the stock of timber. So then we really are able to understand how our timber resources are used and how they change. And in general, we learned, for example, that we use about 1/3 of the regrowth in the Netherlands. So 1/3 of the regrowth each year is being harvested. So in that sense, this is quite sustainable. There's some regulating services also in the accounts. And here you have the capture of particulate matter, PM10. And that is a function of both the concentration of particulate matter and also the capacity of the ecosystem to filter. And so with forests and areas with a high leaf area index, you will have more capture of that particulate matter. So we have pollination and pest control. Pest control, we look at ladybugs, which you see on the top, and pollination is an interesting one as well. That is maybe the most sophisticated model that we developed for the accounts. And you can see in the map the specific crops that need pollination, which is fruit, for example, the apples and the pears that we produce, and also rapeseed, for example, and also vegetable crops. They are showing up, and especially what we map is the small habitats in the landscape, like hedgerows again, and they are providing the pollination service to the farmers. One of the most important services is recreation and tourism. Again, I will go a bit quick, but by province here you see the number of people engaged in hiking, beach, and water sports. And here the physical indicators, the number of overnight stays that are generated. And the map is very recognizable for everybody from the Netherlands, because you can see here on the coast, it's a very popular area for nature recreation. Also the southeast, which is our only hilly landscape, and in the center, the forest landscape. The same study was done in the Philippines, and there we also had a monetary valuation of that recreation service and the tourism service. And we used the resource rent as the monetary value indicator. And the interesting thing is that if you look on the right-hand side, that monetary value that is generated by ecosystems in support of tourism is actually very high, and it adds up to about 500 euro per hectare per year. And this was pre-COVID, of course, but let's hope it will get back to that same amount quickly. And that number is higher actually than what with some of the plantation crops in the Philippines was possible. So I think that really shows that value of some of this ecosystem service can be really underestimated also by local policymakers. Then the carbon account, I will go a bit quick because there's still so much to talk about. There's carbon sequestration and the carbon emissions by peat. And interestingly, we emit twice as much carbon in our drained peatlands compared to what we sequester in a forest. So that is a negative from the side of the ecosystem, unfortunately. But also it's nice to show this one because this has really been one of the examples where our accounts are used in policy making. Biodiversity is also included in the ecosystem accounts as a thematic account, but it's not valued. It's not a monetary account. And of course, the challenge is always then what biodiversity indicator do you use? Because as you can see in the graphs, different indicators have really different consequences in terms of what you see and how the spatial pattern appears. Maybe I'll skip this one because I think I'm taking too much time. I will go to valuation now. There's a few basic principles here. So of course, with ecosystem accounting, we have an anthropocentric approach to valuation. We look at values for people, for the economy. We focus on, in valuation, on final ecosystem services. In physical terms, it's possible to also analyze the intermediate services, but for valuation, we focus on the final services. We value the actual use of ecosystem services rather than the optimal use or the sustainable use. So we look at actual use of ecosystem services. And that's consistent with the system of national accounts. And in general, our valuation principles are also consistent with those of the national accounts. So what's the central concept in valuation? For the, as I understand, this was more economics audience here. So we use the concept of exchange values. And those are the prices at which ecosystem services and ecosystem assets are exchanged or would be exchanged between willing buyers and sellers. And would be, of course, would be in case a market existed. But of course, for many of the ecosystem services, there is no market, and we need to look for alternative valuation methods. And this is actually something really important. And if you would ask me what is the main risk of ecosystem accounting, I would say it's this one, what is in this slide. And that is that we don't assess, we don't calculate the total, the contribution of ecosystems to human welfare, to human well-being. We value the contribution of ecosystems to economic activity. And that's still a useful indicator, but it would be very wrong if people would look at the values of the monetary values of the ecosystem accounts and then say, oh, this is the value of nature, or this is the value of ecosystems. That is not the case. It's the value of the contribution of ecosystems to the economy as measured in a way consistent with the national accounts. And so with the prices reflecting the current economic system. So it's in the slide also, there's nothing, externalities are not considered in these prices, and also for example, consumer surplus is excluded in the accounts. And there's a reason for that, because if we would include consumer surplus, we wouldn't be able to balance the books anymore. And we need to have, anyway, it's central to the national accounts. And it's also why you can say that if you have GDP, it doesn't inform us on welfare or change in welfare. It informs us on change in economic activity. There's still a number of things, of course, which we can do with that valuation approach in ecosystem accounting, of course. So we can still have some comparison of the relative values of ecosystem services. We have to be careful because we've also seen that if you would use a welfare-based valuation approach, including your consumer surplus, that the relative values can be quite different. So for example, air filtration would be worth quite a lot more in a welfare-based valuation approach compared to a valuation-based approach using exchange values. So there may be differences in relative values, which is important to keep in mind. In the end of the day, I think what may also be important is that valuation allows aggregation. So we can, for example, I think a strong message of the GDP is that we can say, look, our GDP increased with 2% or 1%, or it was negative because we had a recession, or we had a recession actually because it was negative. And I think that trend will also be quite important in the end when we talk about ecosystem services. So maybe it's the trend which is more relevant than the absolute value in the end. But we'll see. Of course, some people are familiar with the total economic value framework. So I thought it would be useful to also show how ecosystem accounts relates to the TEV. And you can see that direct use value, indirect use values, you can find them back in the ecosystem accounting approach, but non-use values, intrinsic values not. I think, as always, I'm talking too long. This is really typical for me. So I wanted to show a few examples of how we valued ecosystem services in the Netherlands. For example, agriculture, we also tested different valuation approaches, also to kind of show how things work in practice. I assume most people know the resource rent approach. This is the value, the value of ecosystem services supporting agriculture. So the ecosystem inputs into agriculture for different years using 3 different valuation methods. And you can see, surprisingly, that, but not uncommonly, that in 2011 and 2012, for the resource rent, there was a negative value. And you can see in general also that resource rent varies a lot over time. So, and that led us to also to change our minds a little bit, because initially we thought that the resource rent approach would be the best approach to value this ecosystem service, but in the end we decided to use rental prices. So the land rent paid by the farmer is reflecting the ecological contribution to crop provisioning. This is the thinking here. And of course, the land rent does not reflect other ecosystem services provided by agricultural land, because the farmer would not be willing to pay for that usually. So maybe agricultural landscapes are very valuable for biodiversity or very valuable for recreation and tourism. That is not something farmers are usually paying for. It's not reflected in the price of the land. So that's something you'd have to value in addition. And in the end, of course, you can also sum these values. You can add the value for different services in that sense. I am going to skip this. I will go straight here because I think I'm using too much time. So let's look at the overall picture for the Netherlands. And interestingly, in the UK, also they're quite far with developing ecosystem accounts, and they found values that are really quite comparable, also relatively. Sorry, they found values that are quite comparable relatively and even per hectare as what we found in the Netherlands. So that gave a little bit of more trust in the system, also even in the valuation part. And if you look at the pie chart, you will see that half of the value of ecosystems are related to tourism and recreation, even in the Netherlands. So I can imagine that for Italy, that would at least be half as well, given the importance of that sector for your country. And that is quite striking, isn't it? And in the Netherlands, we are the second still agriculture exporter in the world in terms of value. So, but if you then look at the ecosystem services, you find that actually it is only 20%. So fodder grass is for dairy production, of course, and crop production is the ecological input into farming. And in my mind, it can be explained by a number of reasons. The first is that farming in the Netherlands, maybe in general, in the UK for sure as well, it's very heavily dependent on technology, on inputs of the farmers. So actually the ecological contribution to the sector, is maybe small compared to all the other inputs that farmers are using. And second, farmers are price takers in many ways. In the Netherlands, it's almost impossible to become a farmer unless you inherit the land from your father or your mother, perhaps these days. So that means that actually the return on their assets, on the ecosystem assets that these farmers make is quite limited. And then of course the third thing to keep in mind is that we do not value welfare, right? We value the contribution to economic activity. So of course, if you look at the welfare value of food production, depending a bit on assumptions that you make in terms of substitutability or import-export, but then of course that value of the farming, inputs to farming would be much higher. If you look at the map, you can see that of course this distribution is also reflected in the map. So the areas that are most important for recreation and tourism, they really pop up in terms of the amount of services that they supply. And then in total, the value of these 10 ecosystem services is 6 to 12 billion euros, depending a bit on some of the value assumptions that we made. Let's look at assets. I hope you are still fresh enough to follow me, because maybe it has been a bit of a long presentation. But assets are generally valued in terms of with a net present value approach, because in the SNA there's different approaches to valuing assets, but the only one that really is applicable to ecosystems is a net present value approach, where we look at the present and the future benefits provided by ecosystems, and then we add those one with a specific discount rate, which we use 2 or 3% for, and an asset life which we assume to be 100 years. Of course, in relative terms, then it's almost the same. If you look at the contribution of different services, because we use a net present value approach, it's interesting still to look at the map, and then you see the asset value in euro, 1,000 euro per hectare, and that's provided by ecosystems. And then it becomes striking that this value is very high, and much higher than we all expected. Also, the people from the statistical office, because actually we always thought that land used for residential purposes is most valuable in the country, but actually if you go outside of the urban areas, the value of nature areas is so high that it is on par with land that's used for residential, for building development. So that was quite striking. And you see that the value is very high, 250,000 euros per hectare in some areas. And the value of cropland, the price of cropland in the Netherlands is up to 100,000 euros per hectare. So also compared to cropland, but even compared to building land, except in the cities, the values of ecosystems is really high. So even with our limited valuation approach. Now, I hope I have a few more minutes to talk about policy applications. So what can you do with the accounts? Well, you can monitor the status with a natural capital, because actually it's very hard to answer that question. Are we on a sustainable track using natural capital? Yes or no, because it involves many different aspects, the use, condition, the types of ecosystems. And so with this database information system that you have in the ecosystem accounts, you can now answer that question. Are we managing our natural capital sustainably? Yes or no? And also, of course, we can identify, if not, then where are the key challenges? So which areas, which part of a country, or maybe which type of ecosystem is being under threat. So it really informs on the status of natural capital. As I mentioned already, with the accounts, you can understand the dependency of the economy on ecosystems, the sectors or the jobs, the value, and also the benefits of maybe using your ecosystem capital in a different way. What economic benefits would that bring? And the third application, I think it's important as well, is a ready-to-use database for all kind of policy analysis, because it's very detailed, it's spatially explicit, and even an environmental impact assessment. It's usually the case that you'd have to make all kind of assumptions on what's going to happen, what the status is of your ecosystems, of your environments, and now you can just access that database and you can find it. Now, of course, that means that data in the ecosystem account has to be made available. We developed a portal for that in the Maya project. It's a Horizon 2020 project with partners in 11 European countries. And as part of that project, we developed a viewer that has been taken up by 2 countries, the Netherlands and Norway, also to develop that into a national viewer. It's also in the national language. And that would then allow giving easy access to users of the information in the accounts. So you can, for example, this is the area in the South Holland, so the same province I showed, which has a lot of peat. So you can see here, you can very easily calculate, for example, the CO2 emissions from that municipality, or areas where peat emissions are particularly high. So information on services, on CO2 emissions, it's all in the accounts. You can also make you can define an area yourself. So in an extreme case, you would be a farmer and you would analyze the ecosystem capital on your farm. Of course, our national level models are not accurate anymore at the level of individual farms. So we have to kind of build in all kind of caveats, but then they're working on systems where they use this as a default layer, and then farmers can then supplement that with farm-specific data where appropriate. Now, this one example has to do with peatlands. It's a major issue for us because you see here in that map the peat areas themselves. I can see they're in the west of the country, in the east of the country. It's significant CO2 emissions for our country. It's also an area where a lot of economic activities are concentrated. There's housing, houses that were built. It's also a beautiful cultural landscape, which you can see here. It's close to Amsterdam. Our cheeses are made for a large part on the peatlands. So what do? It's definitely not sustainable because the peat is subsiding every year. It's going down. Some areas with even 1 centimeter per year. because we drain the peat, so that means the peat soil is subsiding, and at the same time we have sea level rise. So for a low-lying country as us, this is really horrible. This is on the longer term one of the main things we have to solve. And the longer we wait, the more difficult it is to solve it. Now, the accounts have helped a little bit in that discussion, and actually that's also reflected in the climate change policy of our government now. For example, one of the things is that we can say, look, we can say that these carbon emissions, the peatlands, they emit up to 12 ton carbon per hectare per year, but it doesn't say very much to people. But if we say, look, if you have 1 hectare of peatland, it emits as much as 7 households, then people start thinking, hey, that is actually quite a lot. 7 households, just 1 hectare of farmland. Or we can say, look, we can look at cost and benefits, and we can say that the cost of the CO2 emissions for any reasonable CO2 price that you can take, actually we took only 30, and that's half the price currently in the carbon trading system. And you add to that the cost of the subsidence and the damage that's being done to houses, as you can see in that graph with the girl on the bicycle. Actually, the house is constructed on poles, so the house stays at the same level, but the street is going down. So that means all the tubes, all the infrastructure is breaking every 30 years and has to be replaced regularly. So if you ever move to the Netherlands, I would advise you not to buy a house in the peat soils. Still, actually, they're building new houses there, surprisingly. Anyway, so if you look at the cost of these houses and the cost of the CO2 emissions and the cost of water management, that far exceeds the benefits for the farmers, the profits for the farmers. And this issue has been discussed in Parliament also, these numbers. And then finally, on the top, you can see that you can do scenario analysis very easily. You can say, look, what happens to the CO2 emissions if you reduce your drainage, if you go from the current drainage to drainage maximum 60 centimeters, which is still good enough for farmers in general. And then actually you already solve half the problem without almost any costs. So that is just, yeah, a critical issue where the ecosystem accounts have informed in different ways the policy debate. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation. I think the ecosystem accounts are potentially a very good new tool. We will have much more information on ecosystem status, ecosystem uses. That's comprehensive. It's good that we have biophysical indicators that also are very policy relevant sometimes, and economic indicators. We can also compare numbers with the GDP, so to put economic development a little bit in perspective of what's happening with our ecosystems on the planet. And we have much more data and hopefully also more transparency, so that people really understand how ecosystems change. I can give examples of that later on, maybe in the discussion if needed. And of course, the nice thing is that it's an internationally agreed standard, right? So countries are able to learn from each other and can do this in a way that we can compare the metrics. Risks, limitations, there are also, of course, risks. First of all, of course, I mentioned that accounts do not capture the full value of ecosystems. So it's not a welfare-based approach to valuation. In most countries, they're not complete yet, of course, because it is it takes a lot of effort also to compile these accounts, so it will take time. And sometimes, of course, in the Netherlands, it's easy to talk, right? Because we're a small country with a lot of data, but some countries are in a different situation. So it becomes a very big effort to compile these accounts. At the same time, I think that there's many, the world is changing fast. There's many opportunities coming up to connect accounts and to connect new data to the accounts, which will make it a lot easier also to produce accounts, and also to include new services. On the right-hand side is, for example, we learned that forests are maintaining rainfall by rainfall patterns. If we cut the forest, we lose the rainfall, basically. And that has now also been modeled. So that is now a new service that we can include in the accounts, and very relevant in Africa, Latin America, for example. And so that I think it means also that accounting really needs to be brought also to developing countries, and they have to be supported with that. And it's not a matter of us bringing something somewhere, but it's also there's a strong demand, because actually when the SIA was adopted as a global standard, there was a very strong push from many developing countries to say, look, we need it as a global standard because we really have issues with natural capital depletion, and the SIA can help us to address those issues. So there's some more points. There's more work on valuation needed. That's not yet a standard, etc. So I think that is the end of my presentation. So sorry for probably taking too long. I didn't have a clock here, which was my mistake. I've spoken a bit too long. Hopefully there's still a bit of time for questions.
Thank you, Lars. You are perfectly... Actually, you're perfectly in time. So thank you for this presentation, which was really full of information and also full of suggestions, positive suggestions for future development and for all the possible uses of this framework. But before leaving the room to questions from here or from people connected from remote, I will call Alessandra Lanotte. Alessandra Lanotte is an environmental economist of the JRC at ISPRA, and she has been one of the teachers of the EVA modules from the very first beginning. And so I asked her to help us to comment on the presentation we have seen today and try to link all the themes, all the subjects, all the issues to the program that we have in EVA and also to the future development and especially the possible use of this structure. So, Alessandra, thank you, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chair, for the floor. Thank you, Lars, for the interesting and comprehensive presentation that effectively described the development and evolution of ecosystem accounts. To me, there are some elements that arise very clearly. First of all, we all know that ecosystems and their services are complex. So actually, the first thing is that there was the huge challenge was really to scale down complexity in order to fit accounting tables. And this is quite clear also from an accounting perspective, because there is not just one module or one set of modules, but there are many components. There is the central framework, and then there is what you defined as the core ecosystem accounts that are extend, condition, supply and use table, monetary asset accounts. And then there are also the thematic accounts that concern greenhouse gases, and then oceans, urban, biodiversity, and so on. So actually, it's not something that can be captured by a single module or a single table. There is a variety of pieces that needs to fit together. And since accounting is not reporting, but it requires a mechanism and rules for fitting all the components together on the one hand, but also to fit all these components with the system of national accounts, that is the conventional, let's say, module. And so this brings to another clear point, that in the case of ecosystem accounting, there is the need for a multidisciplinary interaction. Because on the one hand, you need the natural scientist that needs to bring, let's say, the relevant ecological content. On the other hand, you need economists that needs to mainstream this ecological content into an economic context. But this is not enough, because then you need also national accountants, the statistical office, the one who works with accounts, that needs to provide the framework and the rules to set in a consistent way all this information. So actually, it's quite important and interesting to see how all this effort was undertaken, and actually how you managed to put in relation all these elements, different stakeholders. So this is actually the fact that you scale down complexity, and the fact that you need to scale down complexity, and the fact that you need to put together many stakeholders that, as you can expect, talk different language, use different glossaries, and so on. So this is another element that I think is quite relevant. And then there are some, I would say, specific issues that clearly emerged, like the fact that you need to disentangle the role of ecosystem contribution in commodities that are already part of the SNA. So this is a big challenge. And then there is the discussion on the monetary side, because in your slide it is quite clear when the standard was approved, as long as it deals with the biophysical assessment, it's fine, but then the monetary valuation is not a standard anymore. So there is a lot of unsolved discussion on the monetary side. This is also an issue that deserves attention. And I think that another element that really deserves discussion is the role played by the different institutions within the same countries or many countries at the different administrative level, because as you highlight, there is this importance of the spatial explicitness. So it makes sense to understand or to see a valuable example on how it is possible to relate the different experience undertaken at different administrative level, and which are the roles of the different institutions at different administrative level. This seems to be quite key if considering that ecosystem accounting should become something that is going to be applied systematically. So there will be so many things to say, but I think that I don't want to monopolize too much the discussion. So I thank one more time Lars for his very interesting presentation, and I give back the floor to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra. And maybe Lars, you want to comment on something?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Alessandra, for your feedback. And of course, you've been involved in this process from early days as well. So no, difficult to imagine somebody better placed than to give feedback on this presentation. Also nice to hear that you were involved in the EVA project. Yeah, of course, I agree with all your observations, and I think it's always interesting to look at this, because sometimes challenges are a barrier, but then when we manage to address those challenges, actually it becomes more like a benefit. For example, Rocky Harris from DEFRA, he said, look, in the beginning we found it very difficult to talk to bring these people together, economists and ecologists and statisticians, but actually when we managed to talk, it was very fruitful and we learned a lot from each other. And the ecosystem accounting framework helps us, at least in that sense, by giving us partially at least a common language to look at things. So it does help to set up that collaboration. And the same for looking at data sets. Even a nice example is from the Maya project, where we had a workshop in Bulgaria last year. And there was 3 different agencies from Bulgaria involved: the executive agency, the statistical office, and a science organization, and they had not really shared data before. And now, and there was also the Ministry of Forestry was there, and Environment. And now, because they were working together in this project, they were able to share data, they were able to bring data sets together, and they saw, hey, wait, sometimes the data is matched, then it does, sometimes it doesn't match, so then what do we do with that? And then, and now that we bring the data together, actually we have more information and better information for our policy purposes. So again, it's sometimes a challenge for institutes to start working together. But then again, once you manage, and once they manage, it brings also a lot of benefits. So I think that is, it's not an easy road to walk with ecosystem accounting, for reasons that Alessandra very, very well explained. But I think if that collaboration is then taking place and bearing fruit, it is also something which can really help to make information available. I hope that was made some sense to you, Alessandra.
Thank you. I want to ask whether there are questions from the floor. Yeah, we have. Shall we have a microphone for the room? Yeah. There.
Thank you, Professor Hein. It has been a pleasure to hear your keynote lecture. I'm Lorenzo Lotti from UCL, and I have a question on the difficulties of evaluating nature and biodiversity. Which are your thoughts about the Dasgupta review? which has been recently published in the UK?
Thank you for that question. So I think Dasgupta has been, of course, one of the leading persons for many decades, right, in wealth accounting and looking at accounting approaches also for natural capital. So in that sense, I think his overview, his review was to take stock of all the work that has been done, all the conceptually as well as to a degree with specific indicators and measurements. I did notice that the Dasgupta review did not pay a lot of attention to ecosystem accounting, and well, we had some conversations. I had some conversation with him, but that's also many years ago, I must say. So it is in that sense that my feeling was that it was a missed chance, because I do think that provide a real game changer in terms of natural resource management in exactly the field that Dr. Dasgupta was describing. In general, I would also say that I recognize the risk of presenting monetary values in ecosystem accounts, right? I mentioned it at least 3 times during my presentation. And of course, if you're able to have a wealth accounting approach to natural capital, you would be able to consider externalities, and you would be able to come up with a much better indication of the value of ecosystems. But in my mind, we are not there yet. We don't have the data, we don't have the models, we don't have the economic models to come up with accurate, comprehensive wealth assessments of ecosystems. And I know there's some initiatives there, right? But I think when you then zoom in on the data sets and the assumptions, that is in my mind still in early days of development. So in the end of the day, I think the Dasgupta review is a great piece of work, because it really summarizes very nicely the field, except that maybe ecosystem accounting could have received a bit more attention. I do think that for the longer term and the perspective that Dasgupta is sketching in terms of wealth accounting for ecosystems, it is really challenging. Ecosystem accounting would in my mind be a very good first step, and that could then also provide some of the data that you would need for wealth accounting and more comprehensive value assessment of ecosystems. But I also think that will take decades actually to finish that, and I'm afraid we don't have decades left to try to save some of the ecosystems on our planet.
Thank you, Lars. Other questions?
Thank you very much. I am Arfini from University of Parma. I wonder if there is a relationship between the ecosystem services, so all the stuff that you have presented, with the concept of bioeconomy, and so the evaluation of the economy related that use ecosystem services somehow, and to create a kind of a bridge between these two different concepts that I see that are very relate each other. No, you talk about asset, and the bioeconomy use this asset and to generate value. And so the question is if the bioeconomy system is able to restore the asset of biosystem services and increase or decrease biosystem service due to the activity of bioeconomy related to agriculture, mainly agro-food industry. Thank you.
Thank you for that interesting question also. Yeah, as you mentioned, right? So of course, with ecosystem accounting, we're able to analyze physical terms and monetary terms, how ecosystems support the bioeconomy, support those sectors that depend upon natural capital. So in that sense, there's a strong connection. And so far, of course, accounting is meant as a monitoring system, right? As a measurement of monitoring and information system. But of course, you can use that for all kind of policy analysis and say, look, if you restore an ecosystem here, then what kind of opportunities, what would that bring for the bioeconomy? And so that's a step that you would take in addition to accounting. And I think there's several where we try to make that step. For example, the Merlin project that is now implemented in Europe, and that is also Horizon 2020 funded, and where we try to develop aquatic ecosystem restoration measures, and I use an accounting approach to inform the design of the measures and to also assess the value of those measures. Value creation, I should say.
Thank you, Lars. Some more questions?
Is
it
it
open?
working? Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So, hi, thanks for your presentation. I'm Elena Lagomarsino from University of Salerno. I have 3 main comments, but I don't know if we have the time for all of them.
No, we have time.
Sometimes I find it difficult to connect the great effort that is being put towards creating this framework for ecosystem accounting and the EU carbon neutral strategy of the Green Deal strategy. So what I think is that maybe a way of connecting this to great efforts that are being that are made is that maybe since this framework is providing us with a statistical basis to assess the current mitigation and adaptation attempts toward carbon neutrality, we can use this data to create some indicators that can help us understanding whether these efforts, especially the mitigating efforts, are working maybe by looking at the condition of the ecosystem stock and their capacity of producing services. So yes, this was the first comment, and then maybe I ask I don't know if you want to answer now.
It's better all the 3. I think.
Okay, so the second one, I see that one of the main challenges is to have a standard way of valuing, finding a monetary value for the ecosystem services, especially for these non-marketed services, like the cultural services. So I wonder whether we are trying to find standard techniques that can be applied also at the local level, or maybe we are trying to find some standard values that can be used to, for example, value the contribution of the ecosystem to specific cultural services, like I don't know, the cultural services connected to hiking or other cultural activities. So if we are trying to find a standard value or a standard technique. And the last comment, we always talk about this framework like to have a national account or like regional accounts. I wonder whether we could also try to disaggregate these ecosystem accounts at the level of the single economic entity, because of course there are some firms or enterprises that are strongly depend on the ecosystem more than others, like agriculture or renewable energy. So maybe it can be useful also for the single firms to have separate complementary accounts, complementary to the financial accounts, so they can have really a grasp of, they can grasp how much they depend on the ecosystems. So sorry, it's a lot, but yes, these are my comments.
Thank you, Elena.
Oh, these were 3 great questions, so thank you very much for those. Yeah, so the first one, Green Deal and carbon, and that's really interesting because of course, we also have carbon reporting systems, and there's the LULUCF reporting, which is, of course, there's overlap between LULUCF reporting and the carbon accounts of the accounts. And I remember when we published the first version of the ecosystem accounts in the Netherlands some years ago, then the major problem was that our numbers were different from those of the LULUCF reports. And that created a problem for the ministry, because of course those were official numbers of our Ministry of Agriculture and Nature that were reported to UNFCCC. And now our numbers were quite different. And yeah, we had to come and explain that to the ministry, of course, what was going on. And what's going on is this, basically, that the measurement principles are a bit different between LULUCF reporting and carbon accounting, system accounting framework. One of the differences is that in carbon accounts, as in all accounts, we want to understand stocks, sequestration, and emissions. But LULUCF, of course, is focusing on changes in stocks of carbon and emissions and sequestration. So there's a first difference. Then in accounting, we don't make a difference between ecosystems. We want to measure the emissions and sequestration and the stocks in the whole country and all the ecosystems in the country. So of course it is unavoidable. And then also I think we try to come to a somewhat more standardization in accounting compared to LULUCF reporting, because if you look at LULUCF countries, actually there's quite some differences. And then fourth and finally, I have to say that when we looked at the methodologies, especially for the emissions from peat, I felt that our accounting approach was I cannot say anything else. It was a lot more accurate than what was in the UNFCCC reports. That was not so easy to solve that discussion, I must say. And in the end, we kind of wrote a specific note that the ministry also could use to explain the differences, should that be questions from UNFCCC, for example. Now, at this point in time, Eurostat is coordinating work to prepare guidelines that would kind of explain how to align the numbers and compare. So once that guideline, but that will take some time, is published, then it would help others to also understand the difference between the reporting and the numbers. My colleague in Australia, Carl Obst, he said something interesting to me. He said, well, in Australia, we do differently. We first build carbon accounts, and then we use the carbon accounts to prepare reports. Now, that is kind of a sensible thing to do. But of course, we've set up a whole institutional structure and measurement structure to do LULUCF reporting. So that may be difficult to move in that direction unless you've done that from the start. The second point was on, do we standardize the technique or do we value? Well, we should standardize the technique because every context and every country and every ecosystem and every use of an ecosystem is quite different. And I think also in national accounts, what is standardized is the technique, right? How to prepare the GDP. And even then you see some difference and some choices that are made by countries, and different choices. Sometimes it's logical because countries are different and you need to allow for that level of flexibility, as long as we use kind of standardized concepts for sure, and as far as possible, standardized techniques also. Then the first question is on enterprises and companies, the private sector, and I did not mention that at all in my presentation because, given the name of the seminar on public policies, but indeed there's many efforts in the private sector also to engage in natural capital accounting. And actually, the large consultancy firms, like the accountancy firms, the KPMG and Ernst & Young and PricewaterhouseCoopers, they have each developed their own methodology for what they call true cost, true price analysis. I'm not exactly sure. And they're focusing on enterprises, and I think they are probably making a very good business with that, given that they invested a lot in offering that kind of product to companies. I think much of the work done for companies is actually internal, right? So for internal understanding of the dependencies of the company on natural capital, like informing choices also. What I've seen so far is that in my mind, these methodologies are quite coarse that are used, and it's also maybe logical because, if you're a company with a complex supply chain that is getting your products from so many different places, and then you would need to have and then only one of the users of that natural capital, because maybe you share an oil palm plantation, you get some oil palm from palm oil from a plantation, but other companies also buy some of the palm oil from that same plantation. So who's then responsible for monitoring it? So in my mind, there's great complementarity between those efforts in the private sector and in the public sector. And once the ecosystem accounts are fully published, I hope that they will also be used by the private sector to update and improve private sector natural capital accounts. So there's many companies doing this. And I had some discussions actually with Philips also a few months ago. Philips really wants to invest in this and to develop natural capital accounts for the company. I think it's a wonderful what to do. They're really taking this seriously. They're really investing in it, and they also came to ask for what can the ecosystem accounting approach do for our work. So in that sense, the connections are also initially in initial phase, but they are being made. Thanks for the questions. Very nice to discuss it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. Are there other questions in the floor?
Maybe I have one. This is Matteo Corsi, University of Genoa. I was thinking about your example and the comparison that you made about the costs of CO2 emissions from farmland compared to the profit of farmers. And I was wondering if you can give us an assessment of how closer we are, in your opinion, to have these kind of comparisons being made and being relevant where policy making happens. So, and how closer we are because of ecosystem accounting in particular.
Sorry, I didn't get the first part of your question. I'm so sorry, but could you please repeat it?
I was wondering if you can give us an assessment of how ecosystem accounting is putting us closer to having comparisons like the one you made between the cost of CO2 emissions from farmland and the profits of farmers. These kind of comparisons relevant in the places where decisions are made.
Thanks a lot for the question. I think I understand now. So really, and your question is specifically about the farming sector, right? And then, of course, we're talking about the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy. And can ecosystem accounts also inform the CAP? And I have a PhD student working on that. He published his first paper half a year ago, and now working on his second. So it is it's not so easy that I have to say, because with the CAP, of course, you need European scale data. So that is data availability differs a lot between countries. Also, you need for some of these farm level interventions, such as agri-environmental measures. They're really small scale. I mean, it's about hedgerows and field margins that farmers also get paid for. So far, is kind of being. Is giving payments for efforts by farmers, right? So that's relatively easy to monitor, but not so much for the outputs of the farmers. So in the ideal situation, I really hope that we can reach that. With ecosystem accounting, we would be able to measure maybe impacts of CAP policies on ecosystem service, on the landscape, and use that in the end from the CAP. But I think it is there's real challenges there in terms of data availability, in terms of and that requires a lot of further work. Maybe, if I may, another example, which is more feasible on the short term and which is already happening, is that with a bank in the Netherlands now, there's a project going on in farmers in the west of the Netherlands, and what they are doing is they are monitoring with farm level natural capital accounts. So the structure is quite the same with ecosystem services and ecosystem extent and ecosystem condition accounts. And it's nice that they wanted to coordinate that with us. And so there's even some data from the ecosystem accounts in the system for those farmers. Then the farmers can report on how they manage natural capital in that system. And then the bank is kind of wants for several reasons wants to improve its sustainability policies, and they are offering that's not yet happening, but that's the plan to those farmers also loans on more favorable terms, so that the farmers get a financial reward if they manage the farms in a more sustainable manner. And that's being monitored with the natural capital accounts. But then, yeah, you'd have natural capital accounts in a different IT environment, right? But with the same structure and the same concepts, but different IT environment focused on individuals. And that, of course, is something really nice. And then it also becomes very applied.
Thank you so much, Lars. I think there are no other questions, right? So I think also we have, well, we are at the end of our time. So thank you so much for having been here, for your lecture, for having been, well, here to answer to all the questions. It has been very, very interesting. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye. So now we are right in the right time. So we have a coffee break, and then we start again with the first session and the presentation of the first 3 papers of this day in the morning. So see you in half an hour, 20 minutes.